Now let's take a look at our game manager and our player input manager. What we want to do is have our game manager know whenever there's a player added and then have it hook up or bind up data to that player. And we're going to do that by calling or tying into the player input manager's on player joined event. So we're going to start by opening up the game manager. And in the part where we do our awake, where we set our instance, we've already got our player input manager right here on this object. We're just going to need to get a reference to it. We'll get a reference to it and then register for an event that will fire off whenever a player joins. So to do that, we're going to open up our game manager. We're going to say get component, and we want to get that player input manager. And we'll have open close parentheses. And then we want to register for an event on it. So we can do that by either saving off this player input manager to a variable and then referencing it that way. Or I can just put the dot right after and search for the event that I want. Now, if you look down here at the bottom, you'll see that there are actually a couple different options that allow me to filter things. If I click the lightning bolt, it'll actually show me all of the events, or at least it's supposed to. I don't know why it's not showing me all of the events. There we go. I clicked it twice and now it showed up. So we've got an on player joined and an on player left. These are things that will get fired off or called, or we can tell it to do something essentially when this event happens or when this thing happens. So when a player joins, we want to run some code. So I'm going to just double click on it and hit plus equals, which is going to add a method to be called after or whenever a player joins. So do plus equals, and then we need to give it a method name. I can hit tab to get a game manager on player joined, but I'm just going to type in the name of the method that I like instead, which is going to be handle player joined. I'll add a semicolon, hit the left arrow once so that my cursor's on handle player joined, hit Alt Enter, and then we'll generate a method for it. So what's going to happen is every time a player joins with this player input manager, which remember is going to be the same one because it's on this game object that we're not destroying. It's on this singleton that we're keeping around. So whenever a player joins, we're going to call our own special code handle player joined, and it will give us the player input of the player that joins in a variable named obj, which I don't like. So I'm going to rename that to player input. And then it's going to throw an exception, which is not very handy. So let's start by just logging out a debug log. So we can make sure that all of this is kind of making sense, that we're getting an event when a player joins. We can see it and we can maybe do something with it afterwards. So we'll start by writing the code debug.log, and we'll add in some open parentheses. And here I'm just going to write handle player joined. And then let's add in a space, a plus, and we'll put in player input dot toString, so that way I can see the name of the player or whatever, some input about the player. We'll put a semicolon, and I said some input, but really some data about that player input is what I mean. So we'll save that off. I've got my semicolon at the end. We don't necessarily need the toString, by the way. We can delete that, and it'll do the exact same thing, because what happens is when you combine a string with another object, it automatically implicitly calls .toString on that object, which just converts it to a string. All right, let's save, and we'll talk more about overriding that and some cool things you can do with that later. Let's save though, get rid of the star, and first let's go get rid of these private keywords that I don't like to have. Those two right there in front of the methods. Remember, we do need it here because we don't want other things setting this game manager instance. All right, now that I've saved that, I'll go into Unity. And we're going to open up the console window here, make sure that it's cleared, and press play. Now I expect we'll see our player here. So we're in, I'm in, and nothing happened. If I go over to the next level, you'll see that nothing happens. I'm not getting these player joined events. And the reason for that is actually right here. It's this notification behavior. On the player input manager, by default, it's set up to use the kind of old send message. I call it old, but it's this older default send message system in Unity, which would call events or it would call methods by their name kind of magically. And when I say that, I mean that there's no hookup in the code. The hookup was all done kind of right here. You can see it will send messages to the game object on player joined and on player left, which means that if I had a method in there named on player joined with the right player structure, so with a player input parameter, and an on player left with a player input parameter, it would call those. But it won't call the things that I've registered for, like on player joined. These are C# events, and by default, they're not on. What we need to do instead is change this notification behavior to invoke C# events. Now, if I change my level, you'll see that I got the notification down here that a player joined when I went into a level. And if I go back to the other level, I'll get another notification. Now, if I stop playing, that's going to reset. So I need to make sure that I stop playing, switch it over to invoke C# events, go to overrides, and apply all so that it gets applied to my prefab. I can select the prefab and it should show just like this that I've got invoke C# events. Now if I press play, it should clear my log, or maybe it's just going to add on and I'll get a third and fourth entry depending. Okay, yeah, it's clearing. I get my entry, and you can see that every time I join, I get a player joined message. Or every time I enter, I get a player joined. All right, let's stop playing. And we're going to do, well, our final bit of code here. We're going to hook up our player manager or our game manager to our player data. To make that happen, we'll add a new line right here after our debug, and we'll say player data equals get player data, and we'll pass in player input dot player index. So we're going to create a method that will give us back the player data for a specific player based on their index or their number. Remember, 0 is going to be the first player, 1 will be the second, and so on. So I'll hit Alt-Enter, and we'll generate a method for that. We'll figure out how to get that player data in just a moment. For now, though, what do we want to do once we have the player data? Well, I want to get our player object and tell them to use this player data. So we'll say player input dot get component, and we'll get the player object. And then let's save this off. Actually, let's say var, or let's say player equals, and we'll get that component, just so we can make this a little bit more explicit and a little bit more obvious for what we're doing. So we're getting our player data from this method. We haven't figured out how yet. And we're getting our player by calling get component. Remember, our player input is on the same object as our player script. Let's just go take a real quick peek at that just so that it makes sense. We got our player here and our player input there. All right, let's go back into that game manager script. Game manager. And then in here, let's bind our player to the player data. So we'll say player.bind player data. Now this method does not exist, but it is a very common syntax that you're going to see throughout this course and throughout game development and all programming in general. We want to bind up this player data to this player, which essentially means that we want to associate them together so that they're linked together. We're going to hit Alt-Enter and generate a method for bind, and then we're going to hit F12 and go into it. Now our bind method doesn't have to be complicated. It just needs to set our local player data object to be this player data. So we'll say underscore player data equals player data and save. I'm going to go back, go into our game manager. The final thing we need to do is determine how to get a player data. So what we'll do for that is store off some list of player datas. And if we don't have one for the current player, we'll just make a new one. So let's create a list. I've deleted out my throw statement, but let's make a list down here at the bottom. Make a list of player data, and we'll call this underscore player datas. And let's initialize it. I'll just hit tab so that by default it's a new list and it's not a null list. We don't want it to be null. We want it to exist. So we've got a list of player datas, and then in our get player data method, we'll check to see if we have one for our player index. So we'll say if player datas dot count is greater than our player index, so we have some left, or let's say that we don't have any left. Let's say that our count is less than or equal to our player index. And we'll talk this through in just a second. So if our player data's count is less than our player index, we want to make a new one and add it to the list. So let's do that and then talk through the code. We'll say var player data equals new player data, and player datas dot add, and we'll add in that player data. Just hit tab and it auto completed for me. Final thing that we want to do is return player datas at player index. There we go. It's auto completing. So let's talk this through. On line 34, if we have no player datas in our list at all, count as 0, which is equal to our first player, which is index 0. So it's less than or equal, it's equal. So we'll get a true statement here, and we'll create a new player data, and it'll get added to this player data list. If we call it again, though, say we go to level 2 and we try to get player data for index 0, well, then player data is going to have a value in it. So this will be false, and we'll just return back the player data at index 0 because that's the first player. So we'll get back the first player data. If we add it, put it in a 1 here, so we get the second player, then we would go against count of 1, and we would say, hey, we actually are equal to 1, so our player index is equal to the count. If we've got 1 player here, the second player comes in with an index of 1, we create a new one, and so on. So let's save, and let's go into Unity and see what this magic does for us. So we'll press play. We should be able to run over, grab some coins, watch our coin count go up. Go to the next level. We still have 8 coins. Let's go back to level 1, go grab some more. And look at that, our coin count is persisting across levels because it's now being saved in our game manager. Let's go into the plastic and commit our changes, and then we're going to add a little bit of debug stuff so we can see it slightly better. So we'll save, and we'll say that we've added player data to the game manager and hooked up bindings. And we'll check in our changes.